The knock on my door came at midnight, and I almost did not open it. I had just finished a 12-hour shift at the diner, my feet aching, my apron still smelling of fried onions and burnt coffee. The last thing I wanted was another problem walking into my night. But the sound outside my door was not a knock at all. It was a heavy thud, like something falling against the wood. I looked through the small hole in my door and saw a man slumped against the frame, one hand pressed to his side, his shirt dark and wet in the dim hallway light. My first thought was to call for help. My second thought, the one that actually moved my hand to the lock, was that if I waited even 5 minutes, he might not be breathing when help arrived. I opened the door. He looked up at me with eyes that were sharp even through pain, as if he was studying me instead of asking for help. He did not speak, he did not beg, he simply looked at me, then at the open door behind me, like he was deciding whether I was a threat. "You are bleeding," I said, stating the obvious because my mind could not find anything smarter to say. He gave a small nod, nothing more. I should have shut the door. Every rule my mother ever taught me said so. Do not let strangers in. Do not touch a man who might be running from something worse than himself. But there was something about the way he held himself, controlled even while wounded, that made me trust my instinct more than my fear. I pulled him inside before I could talk myself out of it. He was heavier than he looked, all muscle and quiet strength, and getting him to my small couch took more effort than I expected. He did not groan or complain. He simply let me guide him, his jaw tight, his breathing slow and measured, like he was forcing himself to stay calm. "I have a first aid kit," I said. "It is not much, but it should help." He said nothing, but his eyes followed me across the room as I grabbed the small white box from under my sink. My hands were shaking as I knelt beside him and lifted the edge of his shirt. The wound was not as bad as I feared. A deep cut along his ribs, clean at the edges, like it had been made by something sharp and deliberate rather than an accident. "This might hurt," I warned, and pressed a clean cloth to the wound. He barely flinched, just a tightening around his eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. I worked in silence, cleaning the cut, applying pressure, wrapping a bandage around his torso as best I could. My training was nothing more than a first aid course I took 2 years ago at the community center, but it was enough to stop the worst of the bleeding. "You should see a real doctor," I said, sitting back on my heels. He shook his head, slow and firm. "Okay," I said, though it was not okay at all. "Do you have a name?" Silence. "Fine. Keep your secrets." I stood and walked to my small kitchen, more to give myself something to do than because I needed to. My hands needed a task that was not shaking. I opened my fridge and found what little I had, a container of leftover soup from the diner, some bread that was still soft, and half a plate of rice from the night before. It was not much. I lived paycheck to paycheck, and my meals reflected that truth. But watching this stranger sit on my couch, pale and silent, and clearly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with his wound, I could not eat in front of him and pretend he did not exist. I warmed the soup, poured it into 2 bowls, and carried them to the small table beside my couch. "Here," I said, holding one bowl toward him. "It is not fancy, but it is warm." He looked at the bowl, then at me, with an expression I could not read. For a long moment, I thought he might refuse, that pride or suspicion would win over hunger. Then, slowly, he reached out and took the bowl from my hands. We ate in silence. It should have been strange, sharing a meal with a man whose name I did not know, whose blood I had just cleaned from his side, whose reason for being wounded, and alone in my hallway, I could only guess at. But there was something calm about it too, something that felt less like fear and more like 2 tired people finding a small moment of peace. Halfway through the meal, I noticed him watching me again, not with suspicion this time, but with something closer to curiosity. "What?" I asked. He shook his head slightly, as if to say it was nothing, and went back to his soup. I studied him while he ate. He was younger than I first thought, maybe close to my own age, though something in the way he carried himself made him seem older. His hands were steady despite his injury, his posture straight even while sitting. Everything about him spoke of discipline, the kind you do not learn by accident. "You do not talk much," I said, mostly to fill the silence. He almost smiled, almost. That is fine, I continued. I talk enough for two people most days. My coworkers say I could talk to a wall, and it would eventually answer just to make me stop. That earned the smallest curve of his lips, gone as fast as it came, but I saw it. We finished the meal without more words passing between us. When I took his empty bowl, our fingers brushed for a moment, and I felt something strange pass through me, a kind of awareness I could not name. You should rest, I said, stepping back. I will take the chair. You can have the couch tonight. He shook his head, gesturing for me to take the couch instead. I am not arguing with a wounded man about furniture, I said firmly, and for the first time, something like real amusement crossed his face. In the end, we compromised. He sat upright against the arm of the couch, refusing to lie down fully, while I curled into the armchair across from him with a blanket. I did not expect to sleep, not with a stranger in my apartment, not with so many unanswered questions hanging in the air between us. But exhaustion won eventually, pulling me under despite my racing thoughts. I woke before dawn to the quiet click of my front door closing. I sat up fast, heart pounding, and looked at the empty couch. The blanket I had given him was folded neatly, placed exactly in the center of the cushion. There was no note, no explanation, nothing to tell me who he was or where he had gone. Except for one thing. On the small table where we had eaten, sitting on top of the folded napkin, was a watch. It was not the kind of watch a struggling stranger would own. The metal caught the early light through my window, heavy and polished, clearly worth more than everything in my apartment combined. I picked it up carefully, turning it over in my hands. There were initials engraved on the back, 2 letters I did not recognize, and beneath them, a small symbol that meant nothing to me at the time. I told myself I would never see him again. Strangers who disappear before sunrise usually stay strangers. Whatever debt he felt he owed me for a bowl of soup and a bandage, I assumed he would settle it in his own way, far from my life, and I would go back to my ordinary days at the diner, my ordinary nights alone in this apartment. I was wrong. By the time I finished my coffee and dressed for my morning shift, I had almost convinced myself the entire night had been some strange dream brought on by exhaustion. Almost. The watch sitting on my table told a different story, cold and solid and undeniably real. I slipped it into the drawer of my nightstand, deciding I would think about what to do with it later. Right now, I had rent to pay and a shift to work, and no amount of mystery could change that simple fact. I locked my apartment door behind me and walked down the same hallway where I had found him bleeding just hours before. There was nothing there now, no sign that anything unusual had happened at all, just an ordinary hallway, ordinary morning light, ordinary silence. I told myself that was the end of it. I had no way of knowing that outside, in the street below my building, a car was already waiting. I had no way of knowing that the quiet act of sharing my dinner with a wounded stranger had already changed the shape of my life, in ways I could not yet imagine. I walked toward the bus stop with my mind full of ordinary worries, rent, groceries, the ache in my feet, completely unaware that somewhere in the city, my name was already being spoken in rooms I would never normally enter. The morning air was cold, and I pulled my jacket tighter as I walked, glancing at my watch, my own worn-out one, not the stranger's heavy gold piece hidden in my drawer. I had exactly 11 minutes to catch my bus, and if I missed it, I would be late for my shift, and my manager would have one more reason to remind me how easily replaceable I was. I turned the corner toward the bus stop, my mind already rehearsing the excuses I might need, when I saw him. He was leaning against a black car parked directly across from my building, dressed now in a clean dark suit that fit him perfectly, no trace of the blood or pain from the night before. His posture was different too, no longer the careful stillness of a wounded man trying not to show weakness, but something colder, more commanding, like a man who was used to people moving out of his way. For a moment, I thought I was imagining things, that exhaustion had finally caught up with me, and my mind was inventing familiar faces in strangers. But then he looked directly at me, and there was no mistaking those same sharp eyes from the night before. My feet stopped moving on their own. He did not smile, he did not wave. He simply watched me with the same quiet intensity he had shown on my couch, as if he had been waiting there for hours, patient and certain that I would appear exactly when I did. Behind him, two other men stood near the car, dressed just as sharply, their eyes scanning the street around us in a way that made my skin prickle with unease. This was not a man who traveled alone. This was not a man who simply happened to be passing by. I thought about turning around, walking back into my building, pretending I had not seen him at all. But something in his expression held me in place, a silent question I could not quite name, and against every instinct telling me to run, I found myself walking toward him instead. The closer I got, the more I noticed the details I had missed the night before. The faint scar near his eyebrow, the careful way he held himself even standing still, the quiet authority radiating off him despite saying nothing at all. "You left before I could ask for your name," I said, stopping a few feet away, my voice steadier than I expected. He studied me for a long moment before answering, his voice low and even, the first words I had ever heard him speak. "Damien," he said, "Damien Voss." The name meant nothing to me then, just a name, ordinary in its own way despite everything else about him that was not ordinary at all. I had no idea, standing there in the cold morning light with my bus about to leave without me, that I had just learned the name of one of the most feared men in the entire city. "Claire," I said, offering my own name in return, though he had clearly already known it. "Claire Whitmore." Something flickered across his face when I said it, gone too quickly for me to understand what it meant. "You saved my life last night," he said simply. "I do not forget debts like that." "It was just soup and a bandage," I said, trying to keep my voice light despite the strange weight settling in my chest. "You do not owe me anything." His eyes held mine, steady and unreadable. "You will find," he said quietly, "that I disagree." Behind him, one of the men glanced at his phone, then leaned close to murmur something I could not hear. Damien's expression did not change, but something in the air around him shifted, a tension I felt more than saw. "I have to catch my bus," I said, suddenly desperate to put distance between myself and whatever this was, this strange gravity pulling me toward a man I knew nothing about. He nodded once, stepping back to let me pass. "Go," he said. "We will speak again." It was not a request. It was not even really a promise. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered with the same quiet certainty he seemed to carry in everything he did. I walked past him toward the bus stop, my heart pounding harder than the short distance should have caused, very aware of his eyes following me the entire way. When I finally allowed myself to look back, just before boarding the bus, he was still standing there, watching, unmoving, like a man who had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it. The bus pulled away, carrying me toward my ordinary shift at the diner, toward the ordinary complaints of my manager and the ordinary ache in my feet. But nothing about my life felt ordinary anymore. Somewhere behind me, a man with a name that made grown men glance nervously at their phones was standing outside my apartment, waiting, patient, certain that our paths would cross again. I pressed my forehead against the cold bus window and closed my eyes, trying to steady my racing thoughts. Whatever kindness I had offered a bleeding stranger in the middle of the night had opened a door I did not fully understand, and something told me there would be no simple way to close it again. My shift at the diner passed in a blur. I burned an order of pancakes, gave the wrong change to a regular customer, and spent most of the morning replaying the strange encounter in my mind, instead of paying attention to the tables in front of me. My manager, a tired man named Felix, who rarely noticed anything beyond the numbers on his register, actually stopped me near the coffee machine to ask if I was feeling well. "You look like you saw a ghost," he said. If only he knew how close that was to the truth. By the time my shift ended, the sun had dropped low over the buildings, painting the street in shades of orange and gray. I walked home slowly, half hoping the black car would be gone, half afraid it would still be there, and unable to decide which outcome frightened me more. It was gone. I told myself I felt relief, though something closer to disappointment settled uncomfortably in my chest as I climbed the stairs to my apartment. Maybe that strange morning encounter had been exactly what it looked like from the outside. A wealthy man, expressing gratitude in an intense, unfamiliar way, nothing more. Maybe he had said his piece, and would now let the debt rest unpaid, the way most people eventually let inconvenient obligations fade. I should have known better. I had barely closed my apartment door when a knock came. 3 even. Deliberate raps that were nothing like the desperate thud from the night before. I froze, my hand still on the lock, my heart suddenly loud in my ears. Through the peephole, I saw him standing alone this time. No guards flanking his sides, no car waiting visibly behind him. He had changed clothes again. A dark jacket over a simple shirt, something that made him look less like a businessman and more like an ordinary man standing in an ordinary hallway. Except nothing about him was ordinary. Not the way he stood so still, not the calm patience in his expression as he waited for me to decide whether to open the door. I opened it anyway. "You are persistent," I said, crossing my arms in the doorway, using the small barrier of my own threshold as whatever protection it could offer. "I told you we would speak again," he said simply. I did not expect it to be the same day. A ghost of something that might have been amusement crossed his face. "I do not like leaving debts unsettled. I already told you this morning. You do not owe me anything." I kept my voice firm, though standing so close to him again made my resolve waver more than I wanted to admit. I would have done the same for anyone bleeding outside my door. "Would you?" His eyes studied me carefully, as if testing the truth of my words. Most people would have called for help and locked their door. Many would have walked away entirely, rather than risk involving themselves in a stranger's trouble. I did not have a good answer for that, mostly because some quiet part of me suspected he was right. "May I come in?" he asked. I would rather not discuss this in a hallway where anyone might overhear. Every warning bell in my mind told me to refuse, to shut the door, and pretend this entire strange chapter of my life had never happened. But curiosity, and something else I was not ready to name, pulled harder than caution. I stepped aside to let him pass. He walked into my small apartment like a man accustomed to much grander spaces, yet he showed no judgment in his expression, no visible reaction to the cramped kitchen or the second-hand furniture that made up my entire living room. He simply looked around once, taking in details the way I imagined he took in everything, quietly and completely, before turning back to face me. "Sit," I said, gesturing toward the same couch where he had spent the previous night. "Since apparently we are doing this properly now." He sat, and I took the armchair across from him, keeping the small table between us like a boundary I needed to maintain. "I want to know who you are," I said. "Not just your name, what you do. Why men were watching the street this morning, like they expected trouble. Why you were bleeding outside my apartment in the middle of the night." He was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I could not read, weighing something behind those sharp eyes. "What do you already suspect?" he asked finally. I thought about the watch hidden in my nightstand drawer, the careful discipline in his movements, the guards who had scanned the street like soldiers rather than employees. "I suspect," I said slowly, "that you are not the kind of man who runs a normal business." Something flickered in his expression, respect perhaps, or resignation. "I run several businesses," he said. "Some of them are exactly what they appear to be, others are not. That is not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It is not." Frustration bubbled up in my chest. "Then give me a real one. I let a stranger into my home last night. I bandaged a wound I still do not understand the cause of. The least you owe me is honesty." He held my gaze for a long moment, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, a decision being made. "My family has run certain operations in this city for 3 generations, he said finally, his voice steady and quiet. "Operations that exist outside the boundaries most people consider lawful. I inherited responsibility for those operations 5 years ago, after my father died." The words hung in the air between us, heavier than I expected, though somehow not entirely surprising given everything I had already guessed. "So you are a criminal," I said, testing how the word felt out loud. "I am a man who protects what belongs to him," he said, using methods the law does not always recognize as acceptable. "Last night, I was ambushed by men working for a rival organization. I fought my way clear, but not without cost." He gestured slightly toward his side, where the bandage still lay hidden beneath his shirt. "Your building was the closest place I could reach, before I lost too much blood to think clearly." "So I was simply convenient," I said, feeling something like disappointment I had no right to feel. "At first," he admitted. But you did not have to help me. You did not know who I was, and even after learning what little you know now, you still let me sit in your home." His eyes held mine steadily. "That is not something I take lightly." I sat back, processing everything, trying to reconcile the calm, careful man in front of me with the dangerous world he had just described. "What happens now?" I asked. "You said you do not leave debts unsettled. What does that mean for me?" "It means you are under my protection," he said simply, as though the statement required no further explanation. "I did not ask for your protection." "No," he agreed. "But the men who attacked me last night will eventually learn where I was found and who helped me survive it. When they do, your safety will already be a factor, whether either of us wishes it or not." Fear crept coldly into my chest at his words. "Are you saying I am in danger because I helped you?" "I am saying," he said carefully, "that kindness in my world rarely goes unnoticed by the wrong people, and I intend to make certain nothing happens to you as a result of yours." I stood abruptly, needing distance, needing air, needing a moment to process a truth that felt too large for my small apartment. "This is insane," I said, pacing toward the window. "Yesterday my biggest problem was making rent. Today you are telling me criminals might target me because I gave you soup." "I understand this is difficult to hear," he said, his voice gentler than I expected. "I do not say it to frighten you. I say it because I believe you deserve the truth, and because I intend to ensure it does not become a real threat." "How?" I turned to face him. "What exactly does your protection look like?" "For now, discretion," he said. "I will not draw attention to this address. I will handle matters within my own organization quietly, in ways that do not connect back to you." He paused, something almost hesitant crossing his features for the first time since he had arrived. "And if you will allow it, I would like to repay the debt I owe you properly, in whatever way you find acceptable." "I do not want your money," I said quickly, before he could offer anything of the sort. "I did not assume you did," he said, and something in his tone told me he meant it. "What would you accept then?" I thought about the question honestly, surprised by how much I wanted to give a real answer rather than simply refuse everything he offered. "Honesty," I said finally. "If you are going to be involved in my life somehow, even from a distance, I want to understand what that actually means. No more mysterious guards outside my building without explanation. No more disappearing before dawn without a word." Something like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, small and genuine, in a way I had not seen from him before. "That is a fair request," he said. "Harder to fulfill than money, but fair." We talked for another hour after that, though talked was perhaps too generous a word for how carefully he chose each response, how much he still kept guarded, even while trying to honor my request. I learned small pieces of him, that he preferred quiet over noise, that he had lost his mother young and his father more recently, that the watch he left on my table had belonged to his grandfather and meant more to him than anything money could replace. "You left it on purpose," I said, understanding suddenly. "It was not an accident." "No," he admitted. "It was a promise that I would return. I do not make promises lightly, and I wanted you to know this would not be the last time we spoke." By the time he finally rose to leave, the evening had fully settled outside my window, the city lights beginning to flicker on across the skyline. He paused at my door, turning back to face me with an expression more open than any he had shown before. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for the soup and for listening." "Thank you for finally answering my questions," I said, though my voice carried less certainty than I wanted it to. He nodded once, then stepped into the hallway, and I watched him walk away until he disappeared around the corner toward the stairs. I closed my door and leaned against it, my mind spinning with everything I had just learned, uncertain whether I felt more frightened or more curious about the strange path my life had suddenly taken. I did not sleep well that night. Every small sound outside my window made me tense. Every creak of the old building sent my thoughts racing toward danger I could not fully picture yet. Around midnight, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, simple and direct. "You are safe tonight. Sleep well, Damien." I stared at the message for a long time before finally setting my phone aside, some of the tension in my shoulders easing, despite everything else still swirling in my mind. The next few days passed with a strange, uneasy calm. I went to work, came home, went to work again, and nothing unusual happened at all. I almost convinced myself the danger Damien described had been overstated, that whatever conflict existed in his world would stay contained within it, far away from my ordinary life. Then, on the fourth evening, I found a folded piece of paper slipped beneath my apartment door. There was no signature, no explanation, only 3 words written in sharp, deliberate handwriting that made my blood run cold the moment I read them. We know now. My hands trembled as I read those 3 words again, as though staring at them longer might change their meaning into something less frightening. I checked the hallway through my peephole, saw nothing but empty space and dim yellow light, and still could not make myself feel safe enough to breathe normally. I called Damien before I could talk myself out of it. He answered on the first ring, his voice sharp with immediate attention. "Claire, what happened?" "Someone left a note under my door," I said, my voice unsteady despite my best effort to sound calm. "It just says we know now. That is all it says." There was a pause on the line, brief but heavy, and I could almost picture him going still the way he did when processing something serious. "Do not open your door again tonight," he said. "I am sending someone immediately. Stay where you are." "Damien, what does it mean? Who knows what?" "It means," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "that the men I am dealing with have connected you to me faster than I hoped they would." "I am sorry, Claire. This is exactly what I feared." 15 minutes later, a knock sounded at my door, 3 quick raps followed by 2 slower ones, a pattern I would later learn was meant to signal safety among his people. I opened the door to find a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and a serious expression standing in the hallway. "Marco," he said simply, offering a small nod instead of a handshake. "Mr. Voss sent me to watch the building tonight." I let him in, though every part of the situation still felt surreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life without any warning. Marco settled near my window, watching the street below with quiet focus, while I sat curled on my couch, unable to relax despite his reassuring presence. "Has this happened before?" I asked eventually, needing to fill the silence with something other than fear. People threatening someone connected to him. Marco considered the question carefully before answering. "Mr. Voss protects the people around him fiercely," he said. "But threats like this, aimed at someone outside our world entirely, someone with no connection to the business, that is different. That worries him more than most things." "Why?" "Because you have no way to protect yourself," Marco said simply, "and he knows that." I did not sleep at all that night, though nothing else happened. By morning, exhaustion had hollowed me out completely, and I called in sick to the diner for the first time in over a year, unable to imagine facing customers and small talk, while my mind spun with unanswered fear. Damien arrived himself around noon, his expression tighter than I had seen it before, lines of tension around his eyes that spoke of a sleepless night, much like my own. "I am moving you," he said, without preamble, the moment Marco let him inside. "Temporarily, until I resolve this situation properly." "Moving me where?" "Somewhere secure, a property I trust completely." His eyes searched mine, looking for resistance he clearly expected. "I know this feels like too much, too fast. I know you did not ask for any of this, but I cannot protect you properly in a building with a lock any determined person could bypass in minutes." Everything in me wanted to refuse, to insist on staying in my own space, clinging to whatever remained of my ordinary life. But the memory of those 3 cold words slipped under my door kept my protests quiet in my throat. "Okay," I said finally, surprising myself with how easily the word came out. "But I want to understand what is actually happening. Who sent that note? Why does it matter so much that I helped you?" Damien sat across from me, choosing his words with visible care. "His name is Victor Lang," he said. "He runs the organization responsible for the ambush that wounded me. For years, our families have fought over territory neither side is willing to surrender." He paused, jaw tightening slightly. "Victor does not simply attack his enemies directly when he can avoid it. He looks for what they value, what they protect, and he targets that instead. It forces concessions faster than any direct conflict could." And now he thinks I am something you value, I said slowly, understanding settling cold and heavy in my chest. Yes, Damien admitted. I am sorry, Claire. I never intended for my presence in your life to become a weapon someone else could use against you. This is not your fault, I said, though part of me still struggled to fully believe it. I chose to open that door. I chose to help you. And I chose to accept that help rather than dying quietly in your hallway, he said, something raw entering his voice for the first time. Do not mistake gratitude for regret, Claire. I am not sorry you helped me. I am sorry it has cost you this much already. We packed a small bag of my belongings that afternoon, Marco waiting patiently by the door, while Damien helped me decide what mattered enough to bring. The apartment that had felt so small and cramped just days before suddenly felt like the only safe, familiar thing in a world that had turned unpredictable and strange. The property Damien brought me to was nothing like I expected, a quiet house on the edge of the city, surrounded by tall trees rather than the towering guards and cold marble I had pictured. Inside, the rooms were warm and comfortable, filled with books and soft lighting, rather than the cold luxury I associated with wealth and power. This does not look like what I imagined, I admitted, standing in the doorway of a small library filled with worn paperbacks. What did you imagine? Damien asked, a hint of curiosity in his voice. Something colder, I said honestly, more like a fortress than a home. This was my mother's house, he said quietly, running his fingers along the edge of a nearby bookshelf. She filled it with things she loved rather than things meant to impress others. After she died, I could not bring myself to sell it, though I rarely stay here myself. There was something vulnerable in the way he spoke about his mother, a softness that felt entirely separate from the controlled, powerful man I had come to know over the past few days. I found myself wanting to know more, to understand the person hidden beneath the careful composure he wore like armor. Tell me about her, I said, settling into a worn armchair near the window. He hesitated, clearly unused to sharing pieces of himself so openly, but eventually, he sat across from me and began to talk. He told me about a woman who loved gardening despite living in a world of concrete and steel, who insisted on family dinners every single night, regardless of how dangerous his father's work became, who died of illness rather than violence, a small mercy in a life otherwise shaped by danger. She used to say kindness was the only currency that mattered, he said, his voice distant with memory. I did not understand what she meant until I met you. The words settled between us with unexpected weight, and I found myself unable to look away from him, from the honesty in his expression that felt more dangerous somehow than any threat Victor Lang could send my way. Damien, I started, unsure exactly what I meant to say. I know this is complicated, he said quickly, as though sensing my uncertainty. I know I am not the kind of man you should want in your life. My world is dangerous. My choices are not always ones the law would forgive, and I have already put you in more danger than anyone deserves for a simple act of kindness. Then why are you still here? I asked softly. He met my eyes directly, something raw and unguarded in his expression that I had not seen before. Because for the first time in longer than I can remember, he said, someone looked at me and saw a person worth helping, rather than a name worth fearing or a fortune worth chasing. I do not know how to walk away from that, even knowing how complicated it makes everything else. The silence that followed felt heavier than any words could have, charged with something neither of us seemed ready to name aloud. I broke it eventually, needing to steady the ground beneath the strange new feelings building in my chest. What happens now? I asked. With Victor Lang, I mean. Damien's expression shifted back toward the careful control I recognized from our earlier conversations, though something softer remained beneath it. I am working to resolve this quietly, he said. Territory negotiations mostly, along with reminders of why crossing certain lines carries consequences he does not want to face. And if that does not work, then I will handle it more directly, he said simply, and something in his tone told me not to ask further questions about what that might mean. Over the following days, a strange new rhythm settled over my life. I stayed at the quiet house, unable to return to work while the threat remained active, filling my hours with books from the library and long conversations with Damien, whenever his responsibilities allowed him to visit. Marco remained a steady, comforting presence, teaching me small pieces of caution I had never needed before. How to notice when someone was watching too closely, how to trust my instincts about unfamiliar faces. Slowly, carefully, something shifted between Damien and me during those quiet evenings. He was still guarded in many ways, still careful about how much of his world he revealed, but the walls between us grew thinner with each conversation. I learned about the responsibilities he carried since his father's death, the weight of protecting people who depended on him, the loneliness that came with a position few people could ever fully understand. In turn, I found myself sharing pieces of my own life I had not spoken about in years. The father who left when I was young, the mother who worked herself sick trying to raise me alone, the quiet determination that had carried me through years of exhausting shifts and empty bank accounts. Damien listened with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything, never rushing me, never pushing for more than I wanted to share. One evening, nearly a week after the threatening note first appeared under my door, Marco burst into the library without his usual calm composure, his expression tight with urgency. "Mr. Voss," he said quickly, "we have movement outside the perimeter. 2 vehicles, unfamiliar plates." Damien was on his feet instantly, all softness gone from his expression, replaced by the same sharp, controlled focus I had first seen outside my apartment building. "How many men?" "At least 4, possibly more," Marco said. "They are not approaching directly, just watching for now." "Get Claire to the safe room," Damien said, his voice clipped and urgent. "I am not hiding while you handle this alone," I said, my heart pounding, but my voice steadier than I expected. "Claire, this is not a discussion," he said sharply, turning to face me fully. "These men are dangerous, and I cannot protect you properly if I am worried about your safety instead of the threat outside." Something in his expression, fear disguised as authority, made me swallow my protest, despite everything in me wanting to argue further. Marco guided me quickly through the house toward a hidden room behind the library, reinforced walls and a heavy door that locked from the inside, clearly built for exactly this kind of emergency. "Stay here," Marco said firmly. "No matter what you hear, do not open this door until Mr. Voss or I come for you directly." The door closed, and I was left alone in the small, dim space, my heart hammering as I listened to muffled voices and movement somewhere beyond the walls. Minutes stretched impossibly long, each one filled with imagined dangers I could not confirm or dismiss from behind the locked door. I do not know exactly how much time passed before the door finally opened again, Damien standing there with a small cut above his eyebrow, and tension still visible in every line of his body, though relief flooded his expression the moment he saw me safe. "It is handled," he said, though his voice carried an edge that told me handled had not come easily. "Victor's men were testing our defenses, nothing more tonight, but it confirms he knows exactly where you are." Fear, and something fiercer, something closer to anger, rose in my chest. "This cannot continue," I said. "I cannot keep hiding in safe rooms while men circle outside like wolves." "I know," Damien said quietly, exhaustion evident beneath his controlled exterior. "I am going to end this, Claire. Properly, permanently. I should have moved more aggressively from the beginning, instead of hoping for a quiet resolution." "What does that mean?" He met my eyes steadily, something resolved and unshakable settling into his expression. "It means Victor Lang is about to learn exactly how far I am willing to go to protect what matters to me," he said, "and I no longer care about the cost of proving it." The days that followed moved with a tension I had never known before. Every hour stretched tight with the sense that something larger was building just beyond my sight. Damien left the house early each morning, returning late at night with new lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes, though he never once complained or asked me to worry less about the danger surrounding us both. Marco stayed close during the day, teaching me small defensive skills between long stretches of silence, how to move quickly through unfamiliar spaces, how to recognize the signs of someone following too closely. I absorbed the lessons with a strange, detached focus, part of me still unable to fully believe this was now my life, part of me determined to survive whatever came next. On the 4th day of that tense waiting, my phone rang with a call from Felix at the diner, his voice tight with confusion and worry. "Claire, Some men came by asking about you today, he said. They said they were friends, but they did not look like friends. They wanted to know your schedule, your address, anything I could tell them. My stomach dropped. What did you tell them? Nothing important, Felix said quickly. I told them I did not know much, that you kept to yourself. But Claire, they made me nervous. I do not know what is going on, but you should be careful. I thanked him, my hands shaking as I ended the call, and immediately found Damien in the study, where he had been reviewing documents with quiet intensity. They went to my work, I said, my voice tighter than I intended. Victor's men, asking questions about me. Damien's expression darkened immediately, something cold and furious flickering behind his controlled exterior. He is trying to remind me how easily he can reach the people around me, he said, pressuring me to negotiate on his terms rather than mine. Will he actually hurt Felix, or the other people at the diner? I do not believe so, Damien said carefully. Victor prefers pressure and fear over unnecessary harm to people outside our world. But I cannot promise you certainty, and that uncertainty is exactly the weapon he intends to use against me. That evening, Damien called a meeting with several of his closest associates, gathering them in the study, while I sat quietly in the corner, no longer willing to be shielded entirely from decisions that affected my own safety. Among the men present was someone I had not met before, a sharp-featured man named Nathan, who Damien introduced as one of his most trusted lieutenants. Nathan greeted me with a polite nod, though something about his gaze lingered slightly too long, calculating in a way that made me quietly uneasy, despite having no real reason to distrust him. We need to discuss the Lang situation directly, Damien said, addressing the room with quiet authority. He has escalated beyond acceptable boundaries, involving people entirely outside our world. I want options for ending this permanently. The discussion that followed moved through territory I barely understood, references to alliances and pressure points, businesses and locations I could not begin to picture. Through most of it, Nathan remained quiet, offering occasional input that always seemed to steer conversation toward caution rather than direct confrontation. Perhaps a formal meeting with Lang would be wiser, Nathan suggested at one point. Show strength through negotiation rather than aggression. Less risk to everyone involved. Damien considered this carefully, though something in his expression suggested reluctance. Negotiation has not slowed him so far, he said. I am not confident it will succeed now. It is worth attempting before more drastic measures, Nathan pressed gently. A meeting on neutral ground, properly arranged, could resolve this without further danger to anyone. Something about the suggestion nagged uncomfortably at the back of my mind, though I could not identify exactly why. Perhaps it was simply the tension of the entire situation making me suspicious of everything, even reasonable-sounding advice from someone Damien clearly trusted. The meeting ended without a final decision, though Damien promised to consider Nathan's suggestion alongside more direct options. As the room emptied, Nathan paused near me on his way out, his expression carefully neutral. You have caused quite a stir, Miss Whitmore, he said, his tone pleasant enough on the surface. I hope you understand the weight of what you have stepped into. I am beginning to, I said carefully. Damien is not usually so reckless with people outside our world, Nathan continued, something almost probing in his voice. You must be quite remarkable to have earned this level of protection. I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply offered a small, non-committal smile until he finally moved on, leaving me with a lingering unease I could not fully explain. That night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion weighing heavily on my body, I found Damien alone on the back porch, staring out at the dark trees surrounding the property. Something is bothering you, he said, without turning, apparently sensing my presence before I spoke. Nathan, I admitted, settling into the chair beside him. I do not know why, but something about him makes me uneasy. Damien was quiet for a long moment, considering my words seriously rather than dismissing them. Nathan has served my family for many years, he said eventually. My father trusted him completely. I have never had reason to question that trust. I am not saying he is dishonest, I said carefully. I just have a strange feeling I cannot quite explain. I will keep your instincts in mind, Damien said, and something in his tone told me he meant it seriously, despite his obvious loyalty to his longtime associate. We sat together in comfortable silence after that, the weight of everything unspoken between us settling into something quieter, gentler than the fear and tension that had defined most of our recent days. Eventually, Damien reached over and took my hand, his fingers warm and steady around mine. "I am sorry," he said quietly, "for all of this, for the danger, the fear, the way your entire life has been turned upside down because you chose to help a stranger. I do not regret it," I said honestly, surprising myself with how certain the words felt. Frightened, yes. Exhausted, definitely. But I do not regret opening that door. He turned to look at me fully then, something soft and unguarded in his expression that made my breath catch slightly. "Claire," he said quietly, "whatever happens with Victor Lang, I need you to know that meeting you has changed something in me I did not expect to change. I have spent 5 years building walls around myself, convincing myself that connection was a weakness I could not afford in this world. You have made me question everything I believed about that." Before I could respond, his phone buzzed sharply against the small table between us, breaking the fragile moment building around us. Damien answered immediately, his expression shifting instantly from softness to sharp focus as he listened to whoever spoke on the other end. "When?" he asked, his voice suddenly clipped and urgent. "How many?" I watched his face carefully, fear creeping back into my chest as his jaw tightened with each passing second of silence. "Understood," he said finally. "Secure the perimeter immediately. I am on my way." He ended the call and turned to me, all softness gone, replaced entirely by the controlled danger I had first sensed in him outside my apartment building. "Victor's men are moving toward the eastern boundary," he said. "More than we have seen before. This is not another test." "What do we do?" I asked, my heart pounding. "You stay here, protected," he said firmly, already moving toward the house. "I need to coordinate with my people directly." I followed him inside despite his instructions, unwilling to be left alone with uncertainty while danger closed in around us. The house had transformed in minutes, Marco and several other men moving with quick, practiced efficiency, checking weapons and securing entrances, with a calm that somehow made the danger feel more real, rather than less. Nathan appeared moments later, his expression appropriately grave, though something about his timing struck me as strange given how quickly he had arrived after the threat began. "I have men positioned along the northern road," Nathan reported. "If Lang's forces attempt to flank from that direction, we will have warning." "Good," Damien said, though his attention remained sharp and divided between multiple concerns at once. "Claire, please, go to the safe room. I cannot focus properly worrying about your safety." This time, I did not argue. Marco guided me quickly through the house once more, though something felt different this time, a heavier tension in the air that made my instincts scream with warning I could not fully explain. Just before the reinforced door closed behind me, I caught a final glimpse of Nathan through the hallway, speaking quietly into a phone I had not seen him holding moments before, his expression far too calm for a man supposedly preparing for imminent danger. The door sealed shut, leaving me alone in the dim safe room once again, my mind racing with the strange detail I had just witnessed. Something about Nathan's behavior nagged persistently at my thoughts, refusing to settle into the background despite everything more urgent demanding my attention. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken occasionally by muffled sounds beyond the walls, voices raised in urgent command, movement that suggested organized defense rather than chaotic panic. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to understand what was happening beyond my limited sight, fear and helplessness twisting uncomfortably in my chest. Then, abruptly, the sounds shifted, movement growing closer rather than distant, voices sharpening with sudden alarm. I stepped back from the door instinctively, heart pounding, uncertain whether the approaching danger belonged to Damien's people or to an enemy who had somehow breached defenses meant to keep me safe. The door handle began to turn. I held my breath, pressed against the far wall of the small room, uncertain whether to feel relief or terror, as the heavy door slowly swung open, revealing a figure silhouetted against the dim hallway light beyond. "Claire," Marco's voice cut through the darkness, tight with urgency but unmistakably familiar. Relief flooded through me so quickly my knees nearly buckled. "We need to move you now." "What is happening?" I asked, following him quickly through the hallway, my legs unsteady beneath me. Lang's men breached the eastern fence, Marco said, moving with quick, purposeful steps. Mr. Voss is handling the front of the property, but I do not like how quickly they found the weak point. It is almost like they knew exactly where to look. The words landed heavily in my chest, confirming the uneasy suspicion that had been building since I saw Nathan on that hidden phone call. "Marco," I said urgently, grabbing his arm to slow him. "I saw Nathan on the phone earlier, right before I went into the safe room. He looked calm, too calm, like he already knew what was coming." Marco's expression sharpened immediately, understanding dawning fast behind his eyes. "Stay close to me," he said. "We need to find Mr. Voss immediately." We moved through the house quickly, the sounds of conflict growing louder as we approached the main entrance, shouted commands and the sharp, controlled chaos of organized defense filling the air. I caught sight of Damien near the front hall, directing his men with sharp, focused authority, a small cut above his eyebrow from earlier, now joined by fresh tension lining his entire body. "Damien," I called, unable to stop myself despite Marco's attempt to keep me back. He turned instantly, relief crossing his features when he saw me safe, quickly replaced by alarm at my expression. "What is wrong?" "Nathan," I said quickly. "I think he warned Victor about the eastern fence. I saw him on a phone I did not know he had, right before this all started." Something dark and dangerous crossed Damien's face, understanding settling into place with terrible clarity. "That would explain how they found the weakest point in our defenses so quickly," he said, his voice low and controlled despite the fury I could sense simmering beneath it. Before he could say more, one of his men rushed forward with urgent news. "Sir, we have secured the eastern breach. Lang's men are retreating, but Nathan is missing. No one has seen him since the attack began." The confirmation settled like ice in my chest, watching Damien's expression harden into something colder and more resolved than I had seen from him before. "He has been feeding Lang information," Damien said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "For how long, I wonder?" The attack, as it turned out, had been a calculated distraction rather than a genuine attempt to breach the property fully. By the time Damien's men had secured every entrance and confirmed the immediate threat had passed, it became clear that Victor Lang's true purpose had been something else entirely: testing weaknesses, gathering information, and pulling Nathan fully into the open where his betrayal could no longer remain hidden. "He wanted us to discover Nathan," Damien said later that night, once the property had been secured and the immediate danger had passed. We sat together in the study, exhaustion heavy in every line of his body, though something sharp and determined remained beneath the fatigue. A message, perhaps, that even those closest to me cannot be trusted completely. "What happens now?" I asked, still shaken from the night's events. "Now," Damien said, meeting my eyes with quiet resolve, "I stop reacting to Victor Lang's moves and begin making my own." Over the following days, the atmosphere around the property shifted into something more purposeful, less reactive fear, and more careful, deliberate planning. Damien spent long hours with his most trusted people, working through the implications of Nathan's betrayal, tracing back through months of decisions and information that suddenly made uncomfortable new sense. I found myself drawn increasingly into these conversations, no longer content to remain a passive figure hidden away for my own protection. My instincts about Nathan had proven correct, and that small victory gave me a confidence I had not expected to find in the middle of such danger. "You have a sharper mind for this than you realize," Damien told me one evening, as we reviewed a map spread across his desk, discussing possible locations where Victor Lang might be operating from. "Most people in your position would have simply hidden and waited for this to end." "I am tired of hiding," I admitted. "If I am already part of this, I want to actually help, rather than sit in a safe room wondering what is happening beyond the walls." Something proud and warm flickered across his expression, quickly tempered by concern. "I do not want you in genuine danger, Claire." "I know," I said gently, "but I trust you to keep me as safe as possible while still letting me be useful. That has to be enough." He studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly, something settling between us that felt like a new kind of partnership rather than simple protection. The plan that eventually took shape centered on a meeting Damien arranged through careful, indirect channels. presenting Victor Lang with an opportunity he would find difficult to resist. A chance to negotiate directly regarding territory that had long been a source of conflict between their families. Damien suspected, correctly, that Lang's ego and ambition would draw him toward the meeting despite the obvious risks involved. He believes he holds the advantage, Damien explained, as final preparations came together 3 days later. Nathan's betrayal, the pressure on people connected to me, all of it designed to make me desperate enough to accept unfavorable terms. He does not yet realize how thoroughly we have prepared for this meeting instead. And if he refuses to negotiate honestly? I asked, unable to fully shake the worry twisting through my chest. Then he will learn that cornering me was a mistake, Damien said simply, something unshakable in his quiet certainty. The night of the meeting arrived with a tension unlike anything I had experienced in the weeks since that first strange encounter outside my apartment door. Damien insisted I remain at the property, protected by Marco and several trusted men, though this time I did not argue, understanding that my presence at the actual meeting would only complicate an already dangerous situation. The hours while I waited stretched impossibly long, every small sound outside making my heart race with uncertainty. Marco stayed close, offering quiet reassurance whenever my anxiety became too visible to hide, though I suspected his own concern for Damien ran just as deep beneath his calm exterior. When Damien finally returned, well past midnight, exhaustion and something like relief visible in every line of his body, I nearly cried at the sight of him walking through the door unharmed. "It is done," he said simply, pulling me into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could have. Victor Lang has agreed to withdraw from contested territory permanently. Nathan's betrayal, once exposed fully during negotiations, cost Lang more credibility among his own people than he expected. He needed this resolution as much as I did. "And Nathan?" I asked quietly. "Handled," Damien said, something grim entering his voice. "He will not threaten anyone connected to me again." I did not ask for further details, understanding instinctively that some parts of his world would always remain separate from mine, boundaries I had learned to respect rather than push against unnecessarily. In the weeks that followed, the tension that had defined my life since that first midnight knock slowly began to ease. Victor Lang, true to the terms negotiated, withdrew fully from any conflict involving Damien's territory, and the threats that had once followed me through ordinary streets and familiar hallways finally, blessedly, fell silent. I returned to my old apartment eventually, though Damien insisted on upgrading the locks and adding small security measures I had not previously considered necessary. Felix welcomed me back to the diner, with relieved enthusiasm, never quite understanding the full scope of what had kept me away, though grateful enough to simply have his reliable employee back at her usual station. Damien visited often during those weeks, our relationship settling into something neither of us had expected when this strange journey began. He remained careful about the boundaries between his world and mine, though he no longer hid pieces of himself the way he once had, sharing more openly the responsibilities and challenges that came with his position. One evening, several months after that first desperate knock on my door, Damien arrived at my apartment carrying a simple bag of groceries, instead of the usual gifts or formal gestures I had grown accustomed to from him. "What is this?" I asked, genuinely curious as he set the bag on my small kitchen counter. "I thought," he said, something almost shy in his expression despite everything he had faced and overcome since we first met, "that we might share a meal properly this time. Not out of necessity or crisis, simply because I wanted to." Something warm and full settled in my chest as I watched him carefully unpack simple ingredients, clearly unfamiliar with cooking, but determined to try regardless. We worked together in my small kitchen, laughing more freely than either of us had allowed ourselves during those dangerous early weeks, the easy comfort between us, feeling like the natural conclusion of everything we had survived together. "Do you remember," I said, stirring a pot of soup that bore only passing resemblance to the meal I had shared with him that first strange night, when you would not even tell me your name? "I remember thinking you were either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish," he said, a genuine smile touching his features, "letting a bleeding stranger into your home in the middle of the night." "Maybe a little of both," I admitted, smiling back at him. We sat together at my small table once the meal was finally ready, steam rising gently between us. The same simple act that had started everything now feeling entirely different, no longer shadowed by fear or uncertainty, but grounded instead in something steady and real that had grown between us despite every danger working against it. "I used to believe," Damien said quietly, watching me across the table with an expression I had come to recognize as deeply, unmistakably his own, warm beneath the careful control he still carried, that my world made real connection impossible, that the danger and responsibility I carried would always keep genuine happiness out of reach. "And now?" I asked softly. "Now," he said, reaching across the small table to take my hand in his, "I believe that a woman who shares her meal with a silent stranger, without knowing anything about him beyond his need for kindness, might understand something about the world that I had forgotten entirely." I squeezed his hand gently, warmth spreading through my chest at the quiet certainty in his voice, at the journey that had carried us both from that terrifying midnight knock to this simple, peaceful evening. "I am glad I opened that door," I said honestly, meeting his eyes across the table. "So am I," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of everything we had survived together, more than you will ever fully know. Outside my window, the city continued its usual rhythm, ordinary lives moving forward unaware of the danger that had once threatened to consume mine entirely. But inside my small apartment, warmed by a simple shared meal, and the quiet, steady presence of a man who had once been nothing more than a silent stranger bleeding outside my door, I felt something I had not expected to find in the middle of such danger and uncertainty. I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, completely and entirely at peace. The meal we shared that evening was simple, nothing like the elaborate meals I imagined his world usually offered, but it held more meaning than any grand gesture could have carried. It was proof that we had survived, that kindness given freely without expectation had somehow led us both towards something neither of us had dared to hope for when this journey first began. And as we sat together in the quiet warmth of my small kitchen, the silence between us was no longer heavy with fear or uncertainty, but full, instead, with the comfortable understanding of two people who had chosen each other, freely and completely, despite every danger that had once stood between them.